losing the championship as well. The top prize to one of his proteges, a quiet and intensely focused 18-year-old Bavarian law student named Clement Mayer, who spoke only choppy English and made it clear that he had no intention in practicing the language on me. After botching the spoken numbers and names and faces events, Ben Pridmore landed in 4th place overall, lowering the brim of his black hat and walked out the door alone, vowing that he would begin preparing the next day to reclaim his title 1 year hence. Ed feared even worse. Of the 3 dozen competitors, he was one of only 11 who failed to memorize an entire deck of cards in either of the 2 speed cards trials, which is like a place kicker missing an extra point twice in a row. He'd been gunning for an especially low time that would take him to upper ranks, but he'd lost control and burned too hard. He ended up finishing in disappointing 11th place overall and sulked out the door, sobbed with sweat. I ran after him and grabbed him to ask what had happened. Too much ambition was all he would say, shaking his head. I'll see you back at the house. He walked across the Magdalen Bridge to go find a pub where he could watch some cricket and drink some Guinness until he'd forgotten his failure. Standing at front of the Oxford examination hall, watching the competitors scratch their heads and twiddle their pens as they struggled to recall Miss Rear, I felt acutely aware of how odd it was that we've come to this, that the only place left where the ancient art of memory is being practiced, or at least celebrated, is in this rare field competition about among these quirky subculture. Here, in one of the world's most storied centers of learning, where last vestiges of glorious golden age memory, it is hard not to feel as though a tremendous de-evolution has taken place between the golden age and our own comparatively leaned one. People used to labor to furnish their minds. They invested in acquisition of memories, the same way we invest in acquisitions of things. But today, beyond the Oxford examination halls, open doors, the vast majority of us don't trust our memories. We find shortcuts to avoid relying on them. We complain about them endlessly. We see even their smallest lapse as evidence that we're starting to fail us entirely. How did memory, once so essential, end up so marginalized? Why did this technique disappear? How, I wondered, did our culture end up forgetting how to remember? 7. The end of remembering. Once upon a time, there was nothing to do with thoughts except remember them. There was no alphabet to transcribe them in, no paper to set them down upon. Anything that had to be preserved had to be preserved in memory. Any story that would be retold, any idea that would be transmitted, any piece of information that would be conveyed first had to be remembered. Today, it often seems we remember very little. When I wake up, the first thing I do is check my day planner, which remembers my schedule so that I don't have to. When I climb into my car, I enter my destination into the GPS. Each device's spatial memory supplants my own. When I sit down to work, I hit the play button on a digital voice recorder or open up a notebook that holds the contents of my interview. I have photographs to store the images I want to remember, books to store knowledge, and now, thanks to Google, I rarely have to remember anything more than the right set of search terms to access humankind's collective memory. Growing up in days when you still had to punch 7 buttons or turn a clunky rotary dial to make a telephone call, I could recall the number of all my close friends and family. Today, I'm not sure if I know more than 4 phone numbers by heart, and that's probably more than most. According to a survey conducted in 2007 by a neuropsychologist at Trinity College, Dublin, fully a third of Brits under the age of 30 can't remember even their own home landline number without pulling it up on their handsets. This same survey found that 30% of adults can't remember the birthdays of more than 3 immediate family members, or gadgets have eliminated the need to remember such things anymore. Forgetting phone numbers and birthdays represents minor erosions of our everyday memory, but they are part of a much larger story of how we've supplemented our own natural memory with vast superstructures of technology crutches, from the alphabet to the BlackBerry. These technologies of storing information outside our minds have helped make our modern world possible. But they've also changed how we think and how we use our brains. In Plato's Virgis, Socrates described how the Egyptian god, the inventor of writing, came to Themis, the king of Egypt, and offered to bestow his wonderful invention upon the Egyptian people. Here is a branch of learning that will improve their memories. Yes, said to the Egyptian king, my discovery provides a recipe for both memory and wisdom. But Themis was reluctant to accept the gift. If men learn this, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls, he told the god. They will cease to exercise their memory and become forgetful. They will rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance, no longer from within the self, but by means of external marks. What you have discovered is a recipe not for memory, but for reminding. And it is not true wisdom that you offer your disciples, but only its semblance. For by telling them of many things without teaching them anything, you will make them seem to know much. Well, for the most part, they will know nothing. And as men filled not with wisdom, but with the consent of wisdom, they will be burdened to their fellow men. Socrates goes on to disparage the idea of passing on his own knowledge through writing, saying it would be singularly simple-minded to believe that written words can do anything more than simply to remind one of what one already knows. Writing for Socrates could never be anything more than a cue for memory, a way of calling to mind information already in one's head. Socrates feared that writing would lead to the culture down a treacherous path toward intellectual and moral decay, because even while the quantity of knowledge available to people might increase, they themselves would come to resemble empty vessels. I wonder if Socrates would have appreciated the flagrant irony. It's only because of his pupil Plato and Xenophon put his disdain for written word into written words that we have any knowledge of it today. Socrates lived in the 5th century BC, at a time when writing was ascendant in Greece, and his own views were already becoming antiquated. Why was he so put off by the idea of putting pen to paper? Securing memory on the page would seem to be an immensely superior way of retaining knowledge compared to trying to hold it in the brain. The brain is always making mistakes, forgetting, misremembering. Writing is how we overcome these essential biological constraints. It allows our memories to be pulled out of a fallible wetware of the brain and secure on the less fallible page, where they can be made permanent, and one sometimes hopes disseminate far wide across time. Writing allows ideas to pass across generations without fear of the kind of natural mutation that is necessary. A part of oral traditions to understand why memory was so important in the world of Socrates, we have to understand something about the evolution of writing and how different early books were in both form and function. We have to go back to an age before printing, before indexes and tables of contents, before the codex parceled text into pages and bound them at the edge, before punctuation marks, before lowercase letters, even before there were spaces between words. Today, we write things down precisely so we don't have to hold them in our memories. But through at least the late Middle Ages, books served not as replacements for memory, but rather as memory aids. As Thomas Aquinas put it, things are written down in material books to help the memory. One read in order to remember. The books were the best available tools to impress information into the mind. In fact, manuscripts were often copied for no reason other than to help their copier memorize them. In the time of Socrates, Greek texts were written on long continuous scrolls, some stretching up to 60 feet, pasted together from sheet to pressed papyrus reed imported from the Nile Delta. These texts were cumbersome to read, and even more cumbersome to write. It would be taught to invest less user-friendly ways of assessing information. In fact, it wasn't until about 2000 BC that the most basic punctuation marks were invented by Aristophanes of Byzantium, the director of the Library of Alexandria, and all that they consisted of was a single dot at either the bottom, middle, or top of the line, letting readers know how long to pause between sentences. Instead, words ran together in an undying stream of capital letters, known as scriptio continua, broken by neither space nor punctuation. Words that started on one line would spill over onto the next, without even hyphen. As you can see, it's not very easy to read text written without spaces or punctuation of any kind, or even helpfully positioned line breaks and yes, this was exactly the form of inscription used in ancient Greece. Unlike the letters in this book, which form words that carry semantic meaning, letters written in scriptio continuum function more as musical notes. They signified the sounds that were meant to come out of one's mouth, reconstructing those sounds into discrete packets of words that could be understood first required hearing them. And just as it is difficult for all but the most gifted musicians to read musical notes without actually singing them, so too was it difficult to read texts written in scriptio continua without speaking them aloud. In fact, we know that well into the Middle Ages, reading was an activity almost always carried out aloud, a kind of performance, and one most often given before an audience. Lead ears is perhaps often is a phrase often represented in medieval texts. When Saint Augustine in the 4th century AD observed his teacher Saint Ambrose reading to himself without moving his tongue or murmuring, he thought the unusual behavior was noteworthy, as to record it in his Confessions. It was probably not until the 9th century, around the same time, that spacing became common and the catalog of punctuations grew richer. The page provided enough information for silent reading to become common. The difficulties associated with reading such texts meant that there was a very different relationship between reading and memory than the one we know today. Since sign reading scriptio continua was difficult, reciting text aloud with fluency required a reader to have a degree of familiarity with it. He and it was mostly he's had to prepare with it, punctuate it in his mind, memorize it in part, if not full, because turning a string of sound to be learned before it could be performed. After all, the way one punctuated a text written in scriptio continua could make all the difference in the word. As the historian Jocelyn Penny Smalls pointed out, God is nowhere come out a lot different than rendering as God is now here versus God is nowhere, nowhere, nowhere.